Iron Giant. On the morning of the 5th of May, the passengers along the high road from Calcutta to Chandernagore, whether men, women, or children, English or native, were completely astounded by a sight which met their eyes, and certainly the surprise they testified was extremely natural. At sunrise, a strange and most remarkable equipage had been seen to issue from the suburbs of the Indian capital, attended by a dense crowd of people drawn by curiosity to watch its departure. First, and apparently drawing the caravan, came a gigantic elephant. The monstrous animal, 20 feet in height and 30 in length, advanced deliberately, steadily, and with a certain mystery of movement which struck the gazer with a thrill of awe. His trunk, curved like a cornucopia, was uplifted high in the air. His gilded tusks, projecting from behind the massive jaws, resembled a pair of huge scythes. On his back was a highly ornamented howdah, which looked like a tower surmounted, in Indian style, by a dome-shaped roof and furnished with lens-shaped glasses to serve for windows. This elephant drew after him a train consisting of 2 enormous cars, or actual houses, moving bungalows in fact, each mounted on 4 wheels. The wheels, which were prodigiously strong, were carved, or rather sculptured, in every part. Their lowest portion only could be seen, as they moved inside a sort of case, like a paddle-box, which concealed the enormous locomotive apparatus. A flexible gangway connected the 2 carriages. How could a single elephant, however strong, manage to drag these 2 enormous constructions without any apparent effort? Yet this astonishing animal did so. His huge feet were raised and set down with mechanical regularity, and he changed his pace from a walk to a trot, without either the voice or hand of a mahout being apparent. The spectators were at first so astonished by all this that they kept at a respectful distance, but when they ventured nearer, their surprise gave place to admiration. They could hear a roar, very similar to the cry uttered by these giants of the Indian forests. Moreover, at intervals there issued from the trunk a jet of vapor. And yet it was an elephant. The rugged, greeny-black skin evidently covered the bony framework of one that must be called the king of the pachyderms. His eyes were lifelike. All his members were endowed with movement. Aye, but if some inquisitive person had chanced to lay his hand on the animal, all would have been explained. It was but a marvelous deception, a gigantic imitation, having as nearly as possible every appearance of life. In fact, this elephant was really encased in steel, and an actual steam engine was concealed within its sides. The train, or steam house, to give it its most suitable name, was the traveling dwelling promised by the engineer. The first carriage, or rather house, was the habitation of Colonel Munro, Captain Hood, Banks, and myself. In the second lodged Sergeant McNeill and the servants of the expedition. Banks had kept his promise, Colonel Munro had kept his, and that was the reason why, on this May morning, we were setting out in this extraordinary vehicle, with the intention of visiting the northern regions of the Indian Peninsula. But what was the good of this artificial elephant? Why have this fantastic apparatus, so unlike the usual practical inventions of the English? Till then, no one had ever thought of giving to a locomotive destined to travel either over macadam highways or iron rails the shape and form of a quadruped. I must say, the first time we were admitted to view the machine, we were all lost in amazement. Questions about the why and wherefore fell thick and fast upon our friend Banks. We knew that this traction engine had been constructed from his plans and under his directions. What, then, had given him the idea of hiding it within the iron sides of a mechanical elephant? "My friends," answered Banks seriously, "Do you know the Rajah of Bhutan?"
"I know him,"
replied Captain Hood.
"or rather I did know him, for he died 2 months ago."
"Well, before dying," returned the engineer, "the Rajah of Bhutan not only lived, but lived differently to anyone else. He loved pomp, and displayed it in every possible manner. He never denied himself anything. I mean anything that ever came into his head. His brain imagined the most impossible things, and had not his purse been inexhaustible, it would soon have been emptied in the process of gratifying all his desires. He was enormously rich, had coffers filled with lakhs of rupees. Now, one day an idea occurred to him which took such possession of his mind as to keep him from sleeping, an idea which Solomon might have been proud of, and would certainly have realized had he been acquainted with steam. This idea was to travel in a perfectly new fashion, and to have an equipage such as no one had before dreamt of. He knew me, and sent for me to his court, and himself drew the plan of his locomotive. If you imagine, my friends, that I burst into a laugh at the Rajah's proposition, you are mistaken. I perfectly understood that this grandiose idea sprung naturally from the brain of a Hindu sovereign, and I had but one desire on the subject, to realize it as soon as possible, and in a way to satisfy both my poetic client and myself. A hard-working engineer hasn't an opportunity every day to exercise his talents in this fantastic way, and add an animal of this description to the creations of the Arabian Nights. In short, I saw it was possible to realize the Rajah's whim. All that has been done, that can be done, will be done in machinery. I set to work, and in this iron-plated case, in the shape of an elephant, I managed to enclose the boiler, the machinery, and the tender of a traction engine, with all its accessories. The flexible trunk, which can be raised and lowered at will, is the chimney. The legs of my animal are connected with the wheels of the apparatus. I arranged his eyes so as to dart out 2 jets of electric light, and the artificial elephant was complete. But as it was not my own spontaneous creation, I met with numerous difficulties which delayed me. The gigantic plaything, as you may call it, cost me many a sleepless night. So many, indeed, that my Rajah, who was wild with impatience, and passed the best part of his time in my workshops, died before the finishing touches were given that would allow the elephant to set forth on his travels. The poor fellow had no time even to make one trial of his invention. His heirs, however, less fanciful than he, viewed the apparatus with the terror of superstition, and as the work of a madman. They were only eager to get rid of it at any price. I, therefore, bought it up on the Colonel's account. Now you know all the why and wherefore of the matter, and how it is that in all the world we alone are the proprietors of a steam elephant, with the strength of 80 horses, not to mention 80 elephants.
"Bravo, Banks! Well done!"
exclaimed Captain Hood.
"A first-class engineer who is an artist, a poet in iron and steel into the bargain, is a rara avis amongst us."
"The Rajah being dead," resumed Banks, "and his apparatus being in my possession, I had not the heart to destroy my elephant and give the locomotive its ordinary form."
"And you did well,"
replied the captain.
"Our elephant is superb, there's no other word for it,"
said the captain.
"And what a fine effect we shall have, careering over the plains and through the jungles of Hindustan. It is a regular Rajah-like idea, isn't it? And one of which we shall reap the advantage, shan't we, Colonel?"
Colonel Munro made a faint attempt at a smile to show that he quite approved of the captain's speech. The journey was resolved upon then and there, and now this unique and wonderful steam elephant was reduced to drag the traveling residents of 4 Englishmen, instead of stalking along in state with one of the most opulent Rajas of the Indian peninsula. I quote the following description of the mechanism of this road engine, on which Banks had brought to bear all the improvements of modern science, from notes made at the time. Between the 4 wheels are all the machinery of cylinders, pistons, feed pump, etc., covered by the body of the boiler. This tubular boiler is in the forepart of the elephant's body, and the tender, carrying fuel and water, is in the hind part. The boiler and tender, though both on the same truck, have a space between them, left for the use of the stoker. The engine driver is stationed in the fireproof howdah on the animal's back, in which we could all take refuge in case of any serious attack. He has there everything in his power, safety valves, regulating brakes, etc., so that he can steer or back his engine at will. He has also thick lens-shaped glass fixed in the narrow embrasures, through which he can see the road both before and behind him. The boiler and tender are fixed on springs of the best steel, so as to lessen the jolting caused by the inequalities of the ground. The wheels, constructed with vast solidity, are grooved so as to bite the earth and prevent them from skating. The nominal strength of the engine is equal to that of 80 horses, but its power can be increased to equal that of 150 without any danger of an explosion. A case, hermetically sealed, encloses all the machinery so as to protect it from the dust of the roads, which would soon put the mechanism out of order. The machine has a double cylinder, after the field system, and its great perfection consists in this, that the expenditure is small and the results great. Nothing could be better arranged in that way, for in the furnace any kind of fuel may be burnt, either wood or coal. The engineer estimates the ordinary speed at 15 miles an hour, but on a good road it can reach 25. There is no danger of the wheels skating, not only from the grooves, but because of the perfect poise of the apparatus, which is all so well balanced that not even the severest jolting could disturb it. The atmospheric brakes, with which the engine is provided, could in a moment produce either a slackening of speed or a sudden halt. The facility with which the machine can ascend slopes is remarkable. Banks has succeeded most happily in this, taking into consideration the weight and power of propulsion of the machine. It can easily ascend a slope at an inclination of from 4 to 5 inches in the yard, which is considerable. There is a perfect network of magnificent roads made by the English all over India, which are excellently fitted for this mode of locomotion. The Great Trunk Road, for instance, stretches uninterruptedly for 1,200 miles. I must now describe the steam house. Banks had not only bought from the Nabob's heirs the traction engine, but the train which it had in tow. This had of course been constructed, according to the oriental taste of the Rajah, in the most gorgeous Hindu fashion. I have already called it a traveling bungalow, and it merited the name, for the 2 cars composing it were simply a marvelous specimen of the architecture of the country. Imagine 2 pagoda-shaped buildings without minarets, but with double-ridged roofs surmounted by a dome, the corbelling of the windows supported by sculptured pilasters, all the ornamentation in exquisitely carved and colored woods of rare kinds, a handsome veranda both back and front. You might suppose them a couple of pagodas torn from the sacred hill of Sonagur. To complete the marvel of this prodigious locomotive, I must add that it can float. In fact, the stomach, or that part of the elephant's body which contains the machinery, as well as the lower portion of the buildings, form boats of light steel. When a river is met with, the elephant marches straight into it, the train follows, and as the animal's feet can be moved by paddle wheels, the steam house moves gaily over the surface of the water. This is an indescribable advantage for such a vast country as India, where there are more rivers than bridges. This was the train ordered by the capricious Rajah of Bhutan. But though the carriages were like pagodas on the outside, Banks thought it best to furnish the interior to suit English tastes, with everything necessary for a long journey, and in this he was very successful. The width of the two carriages was not less than 18 feet. They therefore projected over the wheels, as the axles were not more than 15. Being well hung on splendid springs, any jolting would be as little felt as on a well-made railroad. The first carriage was 45 feet long. In front was an elegant veranda in which a dozen people could sit comfortably. 2 windows and a door led into the drawing-room, lighted besides by 2 side windows. This room, furnished with a table and bookcase, and having luxurious divans all round it, was artistically decorated and hung with rich tapestry. A thick Turkey carpet covered the floor. Tatties, or blinds, hung before the windows, and were kept moistened with perfumed water, so that a delightful freshness was constantly diffused throughout all the apartments. A punkah was suspended from the ceiling, and kept continually in motion, for it was necessary to provide against the heat, which at certain times of the year is something frightful. Opposite the veranda door was another, of valuable wood, opening into the dining-room, which was lighted not only by side windows, but by a ceiling of ground glass. 8 guests might have been comfortably seated round the table in the center, so as we were but 4 we had ample room. It was furnished with sideboards and buffets loaded with all the wealth of silver, glass, and china which is necessary to English comfort. Of course, all these fragile articles were put in specially made racks, as is done on board ship, so that even on the roughest roads they would be perfectly safe. A door led out into the passage, which ended in another veranda at the back. From this passage opened 4 rooms, each containing a bed, dressing-table, wardrobe, and sofa, and fitted up like the cabins of the best transatlantic steamers. The first of these rooms on the left was occupied by Colonel Munro, the second on the right by Banks. Captain Hood was established next to the engineer, and I next to Sir Edward. The second carriage was 36 feet in length, and also possessed a veranda, which opened into a large kitchen, flanked on each side with a pantry, and supplied with everything that could be wanted. This kitchen communicated with a passage which, widening into a square in the middle and lighted by a skylight, formed a dining-room for the servants. In the 4 angles were 4 cabins, occupied by Sergeant McNeil, the engine-driver, the stoker, and Colonel Munro's orderly, while at the back were 2 other rooms for the cook and Captain Hood's man, besides a gun-room, box-room, and ice-house, all opening into the back veranda. It could not be denied that Banks had intelligently and comfortably arranged and furnished the steam-house. There was an apparatus for heating it in winter with hot air from the engine, besides 2 small fireplaces in the drawing and dining rooms. We were therefore quite prepared to brave the rigors of the cold season, even on the slopes of the mountains of Tibet. You may be sure the important question of provisions had not been neglected, and we carried sufficient to feed the entire expedition for a year. They consisted chiefly of tins of preserved meat of the best brands, principally boiled and stewed beef, and also murghis, or fowls, of which there is so large a consumption all over India. Thanks to the new inventions which allow both milk and soup to be carried in a concentrated form, we had abundance of both, the former for breakfast and the latter for tiffin, or luncheon. After being exposed to evaporation, in a manner to render it of a pasty consistency, the milk is enclosed in hermetically sealed tins, each of which, on the addition of water, supplies 3 quarts of good and nourishing milk. The soup, too, is condensed in much the same way, and is carried in tablets. As I said, we had an ice-house, in which that luxury, so useful in hot climates, could be easily produced by means of the Carré apparatus, which causes a lowering of the temperature by means of the evaporation of liquid ammoniac gas. Either in this way, or by the volatilization of methylated ether, the product of our sport could be indefinitely preserved, by the application of a process invented by a Frenchman, a compatriot of my own, Charles Tellier. This was a valuable resource, as at all times it placed at our disposal food of the first quality. The cellar was well supplied as to beverages. French wines, different kinds of beer, brandy, and arrack all occupied special places and in quantities to satisfy the ideas of the most thirsty souls. Our journey would lead us through many inhabited provinces. India is by no means a desert, and if one does not spare rupees, it is easy to procure not only the necessaries but also the superfluities of life. Perhaps if we were to winter in the northern regions, at the base of the Himalayas, we might be compelled to fall back on our own resources, but in any case it was not difficult to provide for all the exigencies of a comfortable existence. The practical mind of our friend Banks had foreseen everything, and we trusted him to revictual us en route. The following is the itinerary of the journey which was agreed on, subject to any modifications which unforeseen circumstances might suggest. We proposed leaving Calcutta, to follow the valley of the Ganges up to Allahabad, to cross the kingdom of Awadh so as to reach the first slopes of Tibet, to remain there for some months, sometimes in one place, sometimes in another, so as to give Captain Hood plenty of opportunity for hunting, and then to redescend to Bombay. We had thus 900 leagues, or 2,700 miles before us. But our house and servants traveled with us. Under these conditions, who would refuse even to make the tour of the world again and again? End of Book 1, Chapter 5.